So welcome to tonight's talk about wildlife photography, and particularly about mammals and birds. So basically sort of the rather larger stuff. And I'm Nigel Hicks, professional photographer in Southwest England. I'm going to be talking to you about the ins and outs of wildlife photography. I must admit that I'm a little bit concerned, I have to say, about this, because I've got a funny feeling that some people who expected me to talk an awful lot about f-stops and shutter speeds and telephoto lenses and focal lengths and so on are going to be a bit disappointed, because there's an awful lot more to wildlife photography than simply the equipment and how to use it. Well, obviously that's a pretty important part, but it's kind of the end stage really of a lot of wildlife photography, in the sense that it's the technology, the tool that you use to capture the images that you're trying to get, but actually capturing the images is very often the end of rather a long process. And it's very much a whole series of other things that have to come first before you get to actually to the point of being able to shoot photographically, that is, of course, your wildlife. And that's going to take up a certain part of the talk this evening, as well as some of the actual photography and the equipment and so on. And really a lot of the non-photographic stuff that revolves around wildlife photography is really things like about your relationship with nature and how well you understand nature, which that sounds, those two things perhaps sound a little bit woolly, and actually they are, because it's quite hard to define. It's really sort of an understanding of what it is that's out there that you're trying to photograph and why you're trying to photograph it. And then linked to that, of course, is what you're hoping to achieve with the pictures you're going to get. And then how you're going to go about doing that, how you're going to go about achieving those photos. And so all that really implies an awful lot of research before you get to do quite a lot of your wildlife photography. A lot of preparation, both of yourself and of your materials. And then when you're finally set to go, you get to use your camera equipment, and hopefully the wildlife will cooperate. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And what I'm going to show you next really is, well, as I often do with these talks, a couple of rather boring slides to start with, which are just lists. And these lists are often there to actually remind me what to say as much as anything, but they're also useful for you because it kind of summarizes, hopefully, in a reasonably clear way, what the way that I'm thinking about how I go about doing this. And obviously, when you're looking at wildlife photography, there's all sorts of considerations. First of all, of course, is how to find your animals, especially if you're talking about photographically shooting genuinely wild animals. How on earth are you going to go out there? Where do you need to go to find them? And once you do manage to find them, once you do manage to work out where they are, how on earth do you manage to get close to them, or close enough to get a decent photograph? Anybody who's ever tried to do any bird photography will realize that for bird watchers, they don't have to get anything like as close as we photographers do. So being able to get close enough in order to be able to admire a bird and see what species it is and so on is it's quite a different thing from actually getting close enough to get good photography. So getting close is a real issue. And so linked to that then is the choice then between whether you photograph genuinely wild animals or captive animals. And I mean, it has to be said that in an ideal world, all wildlife would be photographed in the wild, as someone once said to me. But of course, we're not in an ideal world. There are time constraints, there are budget constraints, and often there is simply problems of access. You simply just cannot get anywhere near certain species for a whole host of reasons. And in those situations, then captive wildlife, captive animals are a reasonable alternative. And we'll come on to some of that. Well, I'll show you some of that as we go through looking at the photos. And then if you're going to photograph genuinely wild animals, what's your choice here? Actually going out and trying to find out animals that have really never seen people, don't see people much, or animals that have become really very used to the human presence. And that obviously those animals that can tolerate the human presence varies a lot from species to species, and often even between individuals of the same species, it can vary quite a bit. So you can have, for example, well, one example I often quote is that of the dipper, this beautiful little bird that zips up and down fast-flowing rivers on Dartmoor and Exmoor and similar places. and it's you don't often see it closer to hand because it's so busy flying by at high speed. But there's one or two places, and one place I found is around Lynmouth on Exmoor, where the birds become so used to people that you can really get pretty close to them. So the ideal way of photographing genuinely wildlife is to actually find animals that are not quite so wild, actually have become completely used to people. And we'll see some of that tonight in the pictures as well. And then the next 2 points on the list that kind of go together, really. The choice of species types that you would want to photograph, and then following popular fads and fashions. And there are definitely fads and fashions in wildlife photography. And those fashions may well influence the choice of species that you choose to try to photograph. A lot of the species that you see in photography magazines and books and wildlife documentaries, an awful lot, are those that we as humans feel able to empathize with and anthropomorphize about, that is, put like human characteristics onto, even if it's completely unjustified. So as a general sweeping statement, those are the animals with flat or flattish faces and forward-facing eyes. So ones that, in a sort of vague sort of way, resemble humans, especially if those faces are able to show emotions in a similar sort of way that we can. So we're looking at sort of some of the higher mammals, especially, for instance, like the apes and some of the cats and so on. So the mammals that have forward-facing eyes in the same way that we do, and which we're able to sort of impose our own sort of ideas of emotion and feeling and empathy onto. And then on top of that, of course, there's also anything to do with babies. So babies and juveniles, fluffy and so on, is always going to be cute, which helps us to empathize, which encourages us to try and take photographs of them. But then beyond that, there's this huge, vast area of species that just get completely ignored. And that's one of the areas that I like to specialize in, perhaps to my detriment financially. But there's a lot of species out there that, in terms of conservation and wildlife protection, really ought to be photographed in order to get a much wider coverage, but which largely get ignored by the photographic press and even by sort of wildlife documentaries on television. And linked to that then, of course, then your reasons for going out to photograph wildlife, and that's the last 2 points here again, whether you're going out just whether you're sort of going out photographing wildlife just for the sake of it, just sort of ticking lists, you might say, or whether you're out to capture really the innate beauty of a lot of this wildlife, and whether you're out in doing that aiming to capture just single high quality images, or whether you're going out to try and capture a whole set of images which tell a story about a particular habitat, a particular environment, a place, and the wildlife that lives within there, whether it does be with single species or whether it be a whole multiple species. So the whole sort of range of different reasons for wanting to photograph wildlife, and those really affect your whole approach to it, whether you're, say, ticking lists or whether you're trying to just get single high quality images of particular species, a single species, or maybe a narrow range of species, or whether you're trying to do a photo essay that really tells a story about a particular environment, a habitat, or set of species. So how are you going to go about doing all this? Well, that's my second list. And it really, the wildlife photography has a whole series of challenges, as I've kind of already mentioned, which don't even sort of touch on the camera, before you even touch on the camera equipment quite often. The first, which I've suffered with or struggled with many years, is a willingness to get out of bed very early in the morning and also stay out late. Because for a lot of species, a lot of the activity takes place very early in the morning and late in the evening. So just really at dawn and at sunset and dusk. So it's and not always, not every species, not every habitat has this, but the great majority, especially if you're in the tropics or even in summer here, summer and spring here, you will have a burst of activity at dawn, and then it goes quiet during the day, and then burst of activity again in the evening. So it can require getting out pretty early, staying out quite late sometimes as well. And then coupled to that is the need for a huge amount of patience and persistence. You may spend lots of time with not much happening, and then you may get some activity, and you end up with lots of pictures of rapidly retreating backsides, or nice pictures of tree branches where there used to be a bird sitting, and all this kind of thing. We all end up with lots of those pictures that don't quite work. And we're all full of stories of the one that got away, much like fishermen, really. A lot of persistence of doing it again and again and again until you get it right. And very often, as I found out in doing work, the the more I do it, the luckier I get. And it's not just simply the number of hours you spend out there, but it just seems to be that as you do it more, so you work out more, understand more about what you're doing, and understand more about what the wildlife is or isn't doing. So as I say, you can end up a huge amount of patience. You can end up sitting around for a long, long time, not getting anything at all, no activity, and then suddenly in front of you, things start happening all over the place. And the first thing that you react is you jump, and that frightens the wildlife possibly, or you start fumbling with the camera. You realize that the camera settings aren't quite right. And you can be fairly sure that when you press your finger down on the shutter button to get the camera to focus on the subject, the last thing the camera wants to do is focus on the subject. It either just doesn't focus at all, or it focuses on all the wrong things, branches in front or vegetation in front or behind your subject. And that can also increase the sense of panic. And so by the time you get the camera to focus, the animal is way off in the distance with its retreating backside and so on. So staying calm and doing things in a stepwise manner, and also making sure your camera really is set up long before the wildlife shows up. That's quite an important thing. And then understanding what it is you're trying to photograph. So if you choose a particular habitat and then you want to go and photograph just whatever shows up, or if you're choosing a particular species and want to shoot just that one species or a very limited range of species, do some research in advance to find out how this animal behaves, or how this habitat works in different at different times of year, in different types of weather, and so on. And so if you can work out and predict when how you're going to maximize your chances of encountering the species and the environments that you want to photograph. So that also, of course, involves researching good locations, the times of year, the types of weather, the tide, if you're photographing the coastal or marine habitats or marine species. And then once you've done all that, then you actually start to get out into the field. Then you have to work out how to either stalk very carefully or use a hide. Now, if you're stalking, well, obviously you have the opportunity to actually change your position a lot, but you can be fairly sure that you're not going to creep up onto almost any wildlife without them seeing you. They're going to see you long before you see them. And it's just a question of how alarmed they are about your presence, whether they see you as a threat or whether they actually are busy doing something else and not really too bothered about you. And that can vary again a lot from species to species, from location to location, time of year. Sometimes in the breeding season, animals are so busy doing what they do that you can get quite close to them. So, for example, with a lot of marine birds, most of the time you can't get very close to marine birds, but when they're busy breeding, then you actually can. And that's true even with certain woodland birds as well, that you can get much closer to them while they're busy trying to breed than you would at any other times of the year. And the alternative, of course, is using a hide, and that can take the form of a permanent fixed hide that's been put up by, say, the RSPB or Nature Reserve Management, or a portable hide that you carry along with you and set up. Now, if you're using a permanent hide, then obviously that's going to be in a location where you know there's going to be wildlife. That's why the hide's been set up. But it's very often been set up with a view to wildlife watching, or certainly by bird watchers. And if it's for bird watching, then the hides will almost always be too far away for good photography, even with a powerful telephoto lens. If you've got permanent hides which are designed specifically for photography, as I've used once for badgers, then they will be much closer to the wildlife, and very often the wildlife will be completely used to the hide being there, and that can work very, very well. If you're going to use a portable hide, your own thing that you carry around and just put up, then you've got to be really darn sure that the wildlife is going to be coming your way at some point, that you're going to put the hide in a useful location where the wildlife is going to pass by fairly soon at some point. Otherwise, you're going to waste an awful lot of time sitting in that hide, not making much progress. And you also have to bear in mind that some species are very sensitive to new structures in their environment. So deer and a lot of shorebirds, waders and so on, are incredibly sensitive to anything you set up that they're not used to seeing. So that can be a problem. Other species aren't bothered at all. So again, it can vary an awful lot as to whether a portable hide will work, or whether that portable hide is more help than a hindrance, because obviously once you've got that hide set up and you're in it, you really can't move anymore, and you really have to wait for the wildlife to come to you, or whether you just need to practice stalking carefully. One other thing about stalking actually is that often you will frighten the wildlife away, and because they will see you as a threat. Sometimes, however, you will find that if you just keep on following them around, eventually, doesn't happen all the time and probably doesn't happen most of the time, eventually they will kind of give up and decide that you're not a threat after all, that you're just part of the scenery, and they'll just stop running away from you or flying away from you, and will let you come reasonably close. It takes an awful lot of patience and a lot of persistence, but sometimes that does work. Anyway, then finally we come to the camera equipment. And really, one of the most important requirements of camera equipment is its ability to shoot in very poor light conditions. So ability to shoot with a high ISO, so a very high sensitivity to your sensor, without getting huge amounts of noise in the picture. Because, as I already said, most of the activity takes place early in the morning or late in the evening, and your window of opportunity between there being enough light to shoot and the birds deciding to push off and have a nap for the rest of the day is going to be can really be quite narrow. It only can be as little as half an hour, if you're lucky, an hour or 2 hours. And so the more your camera is able to function better in poor lights, then the bigger you're going to open that window to enable you to keep photographing. So that's quite an important consideration, and that has only become one that you can it's only really in the last 5 years or so that cameras have become good enough that you can actually do this, so you shoot at really high ISO and get good results. Linked to that, all these things interrelate, of course. Into that, of course, is then fast, crisp, and accurate focusing by your camera and lens combination. As I already mentioned, very often when you're in a panic situation, you press the shutter and the shutter button to focus the lens, and the lens just will not focus on the right thing, or it racks back and forth, won't focus on your subject. And it's especially a problem in low light conditions where contrast is rather poor. The focusing will rely on there being good contrast between your subject and its background, and if the light levels are low, the contrast will also be low, and your camera lens often, and the camera itself, will find it very hard to focus on that subject and to actually find the subject in sort of a rather dull, flat, contrastless background. So you need to invest in a camera and a lens combination that has a fast, crisp, and accurate focusing even in quite low lighting. And then lenses. Obviously, we are talking about using telephoto lenses most of the time, and this is where a lot of people get a bit hung up on the really big, powerful telephoto lenses and end up with lens envy. My lens is bigger than your lens, but really you don't want to use a really big lens. The big telephoto lenses can obviously help you get closer to your subject in many ways, but they can be a real pain as well. Firstly, they're a nuisance to carry around. They're big and heavy and cumbersome. You can't always use them very quickly. Secondly, their depth of field can be so small that the amount of a view that will be sharp can be so small that even if your lens is pointing straight at your subject, if it's focusing on the wrong part of the view, you won't even have the slightest idea that the bird or mammal or whatever is actually in the scene. And so you can focus back and forth for a long time before you actually find your subject, by which time your subject is leaving, of course. So big telephoto lens is not always a great idea. What you do have to have is good quality optics to produce sharp images. If you're using long telephoto lenses, it's really important to have good sharp optics. And here I would usually then recommend using a prime lens, that is a fixed focal length lens rather than a zoom. Zoom lenses are much better than they were years ago. And for general work, they are absolutely fine. But when you start getting to these long focal lengths, then I would recommend sticking with a prime lens, a fixed focal length lens, to maximize the opportunity to getting good optics. And obviously having good optics, that then links in with fast, crisp, and accurate focusing as well. It also means driving up costs, especially with a long telephoto lens, and that's one of the big problems we face. It does, of course, to some extent depend on what you're intending to do with the pictures at the end of the day. If they're just for your own personal prints and your own enjoyment, then perhaps it's not quite so critical. But obviously, for someone like myself, who I'm trying to get images used by National Geographic and some of the other picture libraries, then a slight deterioration in image quality due to poor optics of my lenses is actually a fairly serious matter. Then we come to a tripod, stable tripod, good, not necessarily heavy, but generally moderately heavy and stable tripod is fairly important. A lot of your wildlife photography, particularly for birds and mammals, will be taken handheld simply because you've got to move the camera around quickly, and you usually can't move it around quickly enough when it's on a tripod. However, if you're sitting in a hide and you've got to point the camera at one particular part of the view for maybe 20, 30 minutes at a time, so you've got to point the camera, point the lens at the top of a perch where you know there's going to be a kingfisher sitting eventually, you're not going to be able to hold that camera and the lens absolutely steadily on that perch for a long, long period. So in that sort of situation, it's better to have the camera on a tripod, and you can just have it sat there with the lens focused on that perch, waiting for the kingfisher to arrive, which of course it will, undoubtedly, because you'll have done your research in advance and will know that the kingfisher uses that perch all the time. And then finally, a powerful and fast recycling flash gun. Again, I really don't use a flash gun all that often these days, but it's useful to have in the bag. And in fact, say fast recycling, because every time you fire it off, you want to make sure that it recharges really quickly so that you can keep on using it and not have dead periods when you're not able to fire at your subject. Useful in situations where you might have, well, again, in low lighting situations when it's just getting light or it's about to get dark in the evening, you may want to throw some light into your subject. Obviously, it does require having your subject within the range of your flash gun, and that is quite an issue. That often is not the case. Or if you've got something that even in the middle of the day, some wildlife is hiding in, or perhaps not hiding, but is just resting in under some dense vegetation, and there's not much light in that vegetation, then you may need to use a flash just to throw some light in there. Of course, there is the question there of is your wildlife going to be upset by the flash? Is it going to respond? Is it going to make it jump? Is it going to run away? Is it just going to not bat an eyelid? That's something that you have to make your own decision on, whether how much disturbance you want to cause to the animal, risk causing to the animal. Zoo animals very often don't care less. They're used to having flashes fired at them all the time, so it doesn't bother them at all. Wild animals, it can vary an awful lot from one species to another about whether it bothers them or not. Anyway, so that's kind of a sort of a general introduction to all the challenges and techniques you might need to use in wildlife photography, and quite often quite apart from the equipment and how to use the equipment. Now, finally, we're actually going to start looking at some photos, and I'm going to give you some ideas about, to some extent, how they were taken, why they were taken, perhaps, and also about sort of the thing about anthropomorphism. That is, putting human characteristics onto animals even if they don't exist, and the fashions of wildlife photography. I'm going to start off with the last one, the fashions in wildlife photography, and those leading species that always get photographed. And obviously, right at the top of the list are the big cats, the big species of the African plains, the African savanna. And one of those most popular ones are cheetahs, such as this trio here, photographed early one morning, or looking out for breakfast, not looking at the camera at all, which is a shame, but then again, that reassures me that I'm not going to be breakfast. They're looking out for something else. Obviously, one of the reasons why the big cats are so popular for photography, it's partly because we can empathize with their faces and can read emotions into them, even if those emotions are not there. It's also because wildlife photography has become really quite straightforward in these regions, in the sort of the game reserves and national parks of Africa, Kenya, and Tanzania, and so on. Because all the hard work is done for you by the guides and the wardens, who will take you out, and they know how to find the species, how to find the wildlife. So that's all done for you. And the animals themselves have become completely used to the presence of vehicles every day surrounding them, and I'll show you a bit of that later as well. And so you've got the perfect hide, the perfect perch, and you've got the guides to actually get you there, to get you close to the animals. And you can practically drive over these animals, and they won't pay the slightest bit of attention. If, of course, you were to step out of the vehicle, then you would yourself become part of the menu for them. But as long as you stay on the vehicle, you've got the perfect perks for getting in really close to this wildlife. So this is a good example of photographing wildlife that has become completely used to human presence. But even so, you don't want to get too close because you don't want to disturb them if you can possibly help it. Not that these animals are easily disturbed, I have to say. So you're going to be using a telephoto lens. This was done with a 400mm lens. And so not only does that enable you to come in close and really sort of isolate this group from everything else, but it also gives you that wonderful blur behind the animals. So there's absolutely no competition with anything else in the picture for your attention. And they really pop out of the background and dominate the frame and just really have this great portrait of these terrific animals. Similar kind of thing with the lion. Again, both these shots taken in the Masai Mara in Kenya, taken just after sunrise. Great lion portrait, this time looking straight at me, so that enables me to sort of feel that I'm communicating in some way, exchanging thoughts with the lion, which of course is complete nonsense, but it gives us the feeling that perhaps we are. And a slightly static image, but nevertheless a great portrait. Again, taken with a 400mm lens, so the background is completely blurred out, nothing else competing for attention, and really enables us to home in on the face of that lion. And homing in on the face, quite literally, as with people, when you're photographing wildlife, you really need to focus on the face and focus most especially on the eyes. Absolutely nothing else. The eyes have to be sharp because that's what we, as humans, learn quite instinctively to relate to look at the eyes. If the eyes of the picture are not sharp, then the picture often doesn't work particularly well. So then another one of the great species, of course, the great apes, and in this case, an orangutan. This is a captive orangutan in a zoo in China, I have to say, kept in quite good conditions. And that's often the thing about wildlife, animals kept in captivity. If you're going to do that, and you really, in order to sort of help preserve dignity and so on, make sure that if you're photographing only animals that are kept in good conditions and not support those zoos and captive collections where the animals really are not well looked after. Unless, of course, actually that's what you want to photograph, is the awfulness that some animals are kept in. And I have shot that kind of thing as well. But in this instance, it's in a zoo where this big male orangutan is quite well looked after and quite well cared for and is in good condition. And late afternoon sunlight has enabled me to get a really beautiful, I think, very characterful image of his face. Again, characterful, it's a bit anthropomorphic, but it may or may not be justified, but it really shows up his face wonderfully. Of course, getting close to these big males in the wild in Borneo would be an extremely difficult task. You can go to the sanctuaries and the breeding centres to come in close, very close actually to youngsters and females, but getting close to males even in those places in Borneo is actually quite difficult. It doesn't happen very often. So to come in this close to a big male orangutan is actually quite a privilege, really. I end up with a really nice portrait. Perhaps the second tier of wildlife portraiture, the attraction is grey seals, forward-facing eyes again. But in this particular instance, it's completely won over by the fact that it's a baby. So we have these oh so cute baby eyes, along with the white fluffy fur. And just a truly adorable face that you're going to say, oh, that's so cute. The fact that it actually had a growl like a Rottweiler dog is kind of beside the point, but you can't hear that in the photograph, of course. And this is one of those situations where, as I say, the more I do it, the luckier I get. And this is complete serendipity. I didn't go down onto this beach on the south coast of Cornwall looking for grey seal pups. I went down there just to try and get a view of a particular headland on the south coast, and just stumbled across this pup that was actually on its way across the beach to go into the sea. If I arrived at the beach half an hour later, I would never have known the seal had even been there. So it's just a huge piece of luck, and that's the sort of thing that just happens from time to time, and you really have to grab those opportunities with both hands and go with it. Taken with a short telephoto lens, I haven't come in too close. Don't want to sort of upset it too much. Certainly didn't want to put it off on its journey to the sea, but a nice sort of portrait of this little baby grey seal on the beach in Cornwall. And then there's animals which again have this forward-facing eyes and which have a possibly cute face, which in this instance actually does against it, because this animal, which is the Philippine tarsier, a tiny primate, which is unique to the rainforests of the Philippines. It's the world's smallest primate. Because of its cute face, it means it gets trapped quite a lot for sale in the pet trade, and it doesn't work very well because they get completely stressed out and don't survive very long in captivity. So not great. This is photographed in rainforest, but it is a temporarily captive tarsier, because this is an area of rainforest that's been enclosed in a fence, which is used to rear up tarsiers to protect them from predators and rear them, and then re-release them back into the forest to help try and boost numbers to try and overcome the pet trade hunting problem in some parts of the country. Technical aspect is taken with a flash, because the tarsier is during daytime, it's a nocturnal animal, as you might have guessed from its huge eyes. So during the daytime, it just rests on sitting on branches of small trees, sitting in the shade under big heavy leaves. So it's in quite a bit of darkness in the sort of under the canopy, and I used a flash just to light it up. Not sure if it disturbed the animal at all. Didn't seem to budge at all. Wasn't too bothered by the flash. But this was taken on a visit to this place a few years ago, and when I went back again a bit later, they wouldn't allow people to use flashes anymore. So perhaps they decided that the flashes were upsetting the tarsiers. You can see the flash has lit up the animal quite well, and even got a little bit of white highlight in the eyes, which is nice. And you can see the depth of field that is mounted in the picture that's sharp is absolutely tiny. The eyes are pin sharp, which is what we absolutely need. But the nose just in front of the eyes and the ears just behind the eyes are all just becoming rather blurred. So that gives you an indication that the depth of field of this picture is absolutely tiny, just maybe no more than a centimetre or so. So obviously we're shooting here with the lens aperture wide open in order to actually just try and make as much use of what light there was, including the flash, to actually try and get the shot. So again, this is taken with a telephoto lens, but a relatively short telephoto lens. These animals are about 8 centimeters long, plus a tail which is about twice that length. So probably shooting with about a 200 or 300 mm lens from below. And then we're back to a wholly captive animal in a zoo again. This is a golden snub-nosed monkey. It's just one of the world's most stunningly beautiful monkey. Almost impossible to photograph in the wild unless you have a big budget and a big time frame to go out into some of the remotest forests in southwest China. It is one of the species that, despite having forward-facing eyes and being a sort of something that related to us, and therefore we feel we're able to communicate with it and empathize with it, nevertheless doesn't get photographed very often, largely because of its isolation. It hasn't even really appeared in wildlife documentaries very much, with the exception of the recent 7 Worlds, 1 Planet documentary by David Attenborough that it did feature in that. So this is just one of my pictures of captive golden snub-nosed monkey. You see, it's not looking at me, but he's kind of looking kind of thoughtful, eyes open. But if you look at the next image, eyes closed. And to me, again, being anthropomorphic, I'm sort of wondering what's this monkey thinking, and that's kind of, for me, that's what makes this picture with the eyes closed actually is more interesting for me than the one with the eyes open, which is unusual because normally if an animal blinks, that ruins the photograph and just say, oh, that's completely useless. But sometimes you just have to think a little bit more, think a little bit out of the box, and think, oh, well, actually that gives us an added dimension, a little bit of something to think about in this instance, I believe. And again, this is lit by afternoon sunlight, not by flash. It's just sunlight coming in on its compound with the background of its compound falling away into dark shade. So it really, and also of course completely out of focus, so helping us to really pick out the face and all the detail in the face. So then we move on to birds. So I'll come back to mammals again in a little while, but move on to birds. And of course, birds is in terms of anthropomorphism and our ability to empathize, it's really quite a different thing, because there are no flat faces and forward-facing eyes. It's all narrow faces and eyes on the side, and also completely expressionless faces. So we don't, not able, or find it much harder to read what we believe are emotions in the animals' faces. And so birds are a bit of a blank sheet from that point of view, and really difficult to actually empathize with them. So most birds get rather less coverage than many of these top-end mammals, with the exception of a handful of species, one of which, of course, is the puffin, which just so happens to have this very characterful face. So it's not being deliberately characterful or charismatic or giving us that expression deliberately. It's just the way it's made, and it's just set in that expression all the time, and it just so happens appeals to our anthropomorphic nature to want to empathize with that and see it as charismatic and slightly comical. But anyway, in this instance, two lovely little puffins greeting each other by flicking their bills across each other, and the success of this shot really is in timing the moment when you get the best angle, the best sort of connection between the two puffins. Obviously, it didn't take just the one shot, but first of all, have to sort of be aware among all the puffins around you there's this one couple that are about to do something, about to do this kind of activity, and then being able to grab it and then take a string of shots which anticipate really where the sort of best position of the birds is going to be and grabbing the right moment. Also, compositionally, we come up with a very simple picture. Obviously, we've got basically two birds which together create one single subject, but the background is completely simple. It's just a completely out of focus grayness of the sea with nothing else behind, no clutter, nothing else competing for our attention. So really your focus is just on these two birds. And then there's always cuteness, of course, with chicks. And that's the other way we can overcome the lack of empathy that we often feel with birds. Obviously with swans, then we do have what we consider to be some sort of empathy or anthropomorphism, in the sense that we see swans as being very regal and imperious, especially when they take on certain poses. But then everything is trumped by a chick, by a fluffy chick, which actually brings in the cuteness factor. This obviously is a black swan, which is actually an Australian species, but there are a few in Britain that were introduced in the first part of the 20th century. And it is a wild bird, but it chooses to live right in the middle of Dawlish Town on the south coast of Devon, just a few miles from where I am right now. And they breed on this tiny stream in the middle of town, and they do struggle to maintain their population, so they're not sort of about to overwhelm the rivers and coasts around the country with black swans. But it's a great opportunity to photograph something very beautiful that happens every spring. So again, wildlife which has become completely used to the human presence and really doesn't bother at all about you coming quite close. Photographed with a 300mm lens, actually 300mm lens with a 2x converted, so a 600mm lens. I'm not that close, and the reason for that is because I'm standing up on a concrete wall above the river, and that's about as close as I could get. So this is really nice sort of composition coming in very close. Background is bird, of course, and just really cropping in very close on the birds, on the adult bird, and then having the chick the center of the attention, and making sure that the adult's face also was down around with the chick. Obviously, that's nothing I could control. It's just, again, a question of timing, making sure I get a shot at the right moment when the parent has its face down with the chick. And then with birds, again, if you can't come up with anything anthropomorphic or empathetic, then you just create, let's say, a pattern. And in this instance, 3 brown pelicans forming a nice line across the sky, flying over me on the coast of Peru, and just creating a nice dynamic trio here. It also reminds me to think about motion. A lot of the wildlife shots that you've seen so far have been fairly static, which is often the case with portraits, but obviously wildlife in motion is a really important thing to try to shoot. It's also very difficult. It's one of the biggest challenges in wildlife photography, is photographing wildlife that is really moving or active in some way. Birds flying over is one good thing to try to catch, but it is quite difficult to focus on them sometimes, and that's where the camera's focusing can be a problem if it's not really fast and crisp and accurate and able to track a moving bird as well, or moving wildlife of any sort. That's another thing, is for the focus to be able to track a moving animal. That's always critical. Another way, of course, if you photographing a moving flying bird, also let's see its relationship to the human environment. So here, brown pelican flying past fishing boats on the Peruvian coast. The fishing boats hopefully don't compete too much for attention because they're well out of focus, but they do help to set the scene and set the environment. And with a long telephoto lens, 400mm lens, which with the camera is able to lock onto that bird and follow the focus, and so it enables me to shoot it as it flies by. And then back to the mammals, back to the lion on the Masai Mara. If a rather static portrait of a single animal doesn't appeal to you, then you can wait a while and wait until a trio have a bit of a punch up over who's going to get the best bit of a wildebeest that they've recently killed. There's a little bit of an odd picture. It's a bit messy, but nevertheless it shows the real life of the Masai Mara. The three lions sort of scrapping a little bit over this wildebeest. And one of the most stunning things is the fabulously green eye of the wildebeest caught by the early morning sunlight. I find that quite remarkable. It's an interesting piece of dynamic movement among the wildlife there. Again, shot with a 400mm lens from a vehicle. The animal's absolutely not at all bothered by our presence. But then the really big challenge is a bird flying by very fast, like a puffin. It's a really small bird, so it's difficult to get in close. And they move at one heck of a speed. So if it's moving from right to left, it's not too difficult in some ways for the lens to track its focus, as long as you can keep the lens as you pan the lens, you can keep up with the bird because it's moving so darn fast. And then obviously fire off fairly rapidly a string of shots with a very fast shutter speed. I checked this before it came on, and it's at 1250th of a second to actually manage to get this really freeze the movement of this bird, of this puffin, as it flies past at one heck of a speed. This is as was the previous puffin shot on the Farne Islands off the coast of Northumberland. Again, 300mm lens with a 2x converter, so 600mm lens, coupled with a crop sensor camera, so we're getting up to about 900 or 1000mm overall to come in close on that bird. And the picture is I've not cropped it. That's actually the full frame that the picture came out as. And then penguins, everybody loves a penguin because, again, they appear to have such great faces and to be real characters. Of course, they don't think they've got that character. It's an anthropomorphism that we put onto them to have to look at their faces and the way they move and their bodies and so on. But in terms of activity, they don't move particularly fast, but their action, in this case, bird caught right at the height of a bellow. They make quite a honking noise, and if you can catch it at the full bellow, then you get a really nice active shot like this. Again, taken with a 400mm lens, as you can see in full sunlight in the middle of the day. The penguins really don't go and hide very much unless it gets really hot, in which case then they might go into their burrows or go into the sea. But this is taken in Patagonia, in the Argentinian part of Patagonia. And then back in Kenya, this image has been cropped a bit because I couldn't get that close to this masked weaver. Masked weavers are well known for their incredible nests that they build, just literally weaving grass together to build this nest that hangs off branches. And I find this a really interesting piece of activity which I'd like to home in on. Again, something that's not photographed all that often, but you do occasionally see it in publications and in wildlife documentaries and so on. 400mm lens, but one that I really couldn't get close enough to actually not then crop the picture afterwards. And then we come to flamingos. And flamingos, again, not one that we can really empathize with. They don't have a particularly human-like face, of course, but we kind of rather enjoy seeing them because of their crazy shape, tall and lanky, a bit like me, and their incredible pink color, which is not something that I have. But just a beautiful pinkness in this instance, just a single bird shot against the sun, not quite in silhouette. The camera's picked up detail in the shadow there, but really showing us the outline of the bird really nicely. Again, it's a 300mm lens. I think it's a 2x converter, so it's actually some distance off this bird, taken in the Camargue in the south of France. Or you compare this with one where you back off a bit, then you start to show a large group of flamingos, which are really showing up their pinkness in the full sunlight. This is Lake Nakuru National Park in Kenya, really homing in on a big group of flamingos. And you can see most of them are out of focus. That's fine. You're very rarely going to be able to get a big enough depth of field where you're going to get them all sharp. So you home in on one particular group and use that to have those sharp, so that your attention homes in on just that one particular group left of center of the picture, and the rest of the out of focus flamingos just form part of the scene. But the sharp ones, and here we have here left of center, are really the center of interest and really give you a sense of the sort of the great mass of birds you have on this lake. Again, it's a 400mm lens, possibly with a 2x converter. I think it probably is with a 2x converter. Could well have had the camera on a tripod in this situation. And then we come to certain birds that really do get completely ignored, and this is sort of one of the things which sort of annoys me a little bit, because this is a shag in the Farne Islands, and it's quite a common bird in certain parts of the country. It's quite a common bird. It's very closely related to the cormorant, but it's quite distinct. And people think, oh, it's just a rather boring black bird, but actually when you take a portrait like this, you see it's just really quite beautiful, with really iridescent green feathers and a beautiful shape. Just again, a great portrait with the background completely out of focus. It's a 300mm lens. No need for a 2x converter. They're able to come in quite close. The birds are breeding on the Farne Islands when you're able to go to see them, so you can come in pretty close. They're used to the human presence, and because they're busy breeding, you can come in quite close, and there's not much of a problem. And then you come in really close to a bird that's actually sitting on a nest, so and sitting quite close to the footpath I was allowed to use. And then you really get to see what you might call the character of this bird, this beady green eye. I mean, whoever guessed that shags have these incredible green eyes, plus also this wonderful tuft on the forehead, which really is one of the distinguishing features that sets them apart from cormorants. And notice that also the depth of field is quite shallow, and the bill is out of focus. Focus on the eye. That's what you always have to do, is focus on the eye. If I focus on the bill, the eye would have been blurred, and the picture would not have worked. And of course, also the tuft here would have been blurred as well. So better to have the bill blurred and the eye sharp. And then guillemots. Guillemots are hugely important in sort of coastal bird colonies. You have tens of thousands of them, and yet the photographers going to these places like the Farne Islands completely ignore them. They point the cameras at the puffins and completely ignore the guillemots, because they are said to be a rather boring bird. Well, they are. Most people think they're just black and white. Of course, actually, when you come close to them and see them in sunlight, they're actually brown and white in many instances, and certainly in this instance. And again, I've done the same sort of things I did with the puffins. I've picked out just a pair from the mass of birds, ones that were actually starting to have a bit of a greeting ritual. And so I went through that, followed them through the greeting ritual, the string of pictures, and just picked out one or two of the pictures that had the best composition in terms of the two birds together, sharing their bills, you might say. Background is not quite as simple as I would have liked. This big black blob behind is a shag, in fact, but it's way out of focus, and I hope it doesn't distract from the overall composition of the two guillemots too much. Or you can then pull away from those close portraits, and you can see the crowd of the colony, and just see just what crowded conditions these guillemots live in, and that really tells you about their environment and just how many guillemots there might be. And that's sort of one of the important things about telling a story about a place, not just collecting high quality portraits of individuals, but starting to the environment that they live in. And pull back still further, which would be really a critical thing. If I wanted to do a story about the Farne Islands, or a story indeed about guillemots, then this is what sort of thing you would do. You should just do some close portraits, but also wider shots that help to tell you the story. And then photographically, they may not be the most fantastic pictures, but what they do is they help to tell you the story. And that's what's really important here, is telling us a story about the Farne Islands and the kind of environment, kind of habitat it is. So thousands of guillemots on top of this cliff here, a few kittiwakes nesting on the cliff, and then in the foreground, we've got a couple of shags as well, plus a few more guillemots as well. It's taken then with a wide angle lens. It's not actually really a wide angle view, but it's taken with a 24 to 105mm lens, set sort of at roughly sort of 50mm, I believe, and in just really quite not exactly strong sunlight, but very clear conditions. You can see that the visibility is just absolutely fantastic. So very clear conditions in the middle of the day, because obviously there's nowhere for these birds to hide. They're not going to go anywhere. They're breeding, so they're or there the whole day long. And then back to mammals again, back to Kenya. A waterbuck, an animal that doesn't get photographed very much. It's an animal with a narrow face and sideways eyes. So it's one that it doesn't have sort of a face that a human can relate to that much. But nevertheless, it's a very beautiful animal. And this is a close-up portrait of a female taken in Nairobi National Park. But then if we back off a bit, Lake Nakuru National Park, to a male, that really gives us an idea of the habitat, the environment that they live in. Both shots are taken from a vehicle, so I'm able to come in quite close to them so I don't have to use a big lens, 300mm lens, maybe 400mm, not hugely powerful lens. I think the portrait on the previous shot was taken with a 400mm lens, so I was able to come in really quite close. This is possibly also a 400mm lens, but taken from much further away to give me an idea, A, what the whole animal looks like, and B, the environment that it lives in, which is basically very wet, swampy areas around the edges of lakes. If you're wondering what that pale pink haze is in the background, that's all flamingos, which is just, so that helps to sort of tell you about the environment and set the scene for where this waterbuck might live. And then another animal we don't hear very much about, the guanaco. These are juveniles, so we got the cuteness factor here. Rather narrow faces, side-on eyes, the one that we don't necessarily empathize with greatly, which is perhaps one reason why they don't get photographed very much, quite apart from the fact that they're way over in Chile, in the Patagonian part of Chile. But again, because they're juveniles, they have the cuteness factor, a little bit fluffy, and not too shy of me. Again, I'm sitting in a vehicle, it's a bit rather similar to photographing wildlife on the plains of Africa. You go onto the pampas grasses of Chile and have a similar sort of situation, being able to photograph the wildlife there, which consists largely of guanaco and rheas and so forth, which sometimes you can get close to and sometimes you can't, but guanaco are usually fairly approachable, as with this group. What really makes this picture actually is that all four of them are looking at me, and so there's really is, from my perspective, quite a real interaction between me and them. Whether they think so, of course, is another matter entirely. Gosh, running such short a time. And then there's bats. Well, bats are obviously much maligned animals, but nobody photographs them, which is a shame. Obviously, in Britain, we only have insectivorous bats, so they're really tiny, and also they're all protected. It's against the law to disturb them, so it can be very difficult to get permission to photograph them. But in other countries, such as here, the Philippines, fruit bats are very common, and they're rather large animals. This is actually a juvenile again, so it's rather smaller, but it's what's called an island flying fox. And it's this lovely fellow. They're actually, you can see, they're called flying foxes for good reason. See, the faces are really quite pretty. And once you get your head around seeing it upside down, it really is quite an attractive animal that you can relate to. And it's photographed again towards the end of the day in shadow under a tree. So had to put the ISO up, use a 400mm telephoto lens so as not to come too close to it. It was reasonably happy hanging around in the tree with me close to it, but didn't want to come too close to cause too much disturbance. You don't really want to disturb your animals if you can possibly help it. So able to get this quite nice shot, and unusual because fruit bats usually hang around in very large groups high up in the trees and difficult to photograph because they're so high up. But this particular individual was hanging around very low down, just not that far off the ground, so I was able to get really quite a nice close-up portrait of him. Similar kind of thing, rats. Nobody likes a rat. It's really unfortunate this animal has rat in its name. It's a northern Luzon giant cloud rat, so an animal that's totally unique to the northern half of Luzon, which is the Philippines' main island. And actually, they're really very cute and very beautiful. And nobody photographs them. Nobody wants to go anywhere near them because they got rat in their name. So really, one has to sort of overcome and do away with the preconceptions and just really look at an animal for what it is and for its beauty, for its importance in its natural environment. This is actually a zoo animal. The previous one says is wild, but this is a zoo animal because they are quite hard to find in the wild. And then we move on again to another Philippine species of Samara Hornbill, which is again another endangered species, but this is photographed in the wild. And this one I was able to photograph in the rainforest on the island of Samara in the south of the Philippines. Those of you who've bought my book, Wild Philippines, will recognize this as the cover shot from that book. hornbills have we have the advantage with hornbills that they're quite large birds and they go around in big sociable groups and they're not really that bothered about people as long as you don't make lots of noise and act aggressively. If you're quiet and sit quietly, they'll let you come reasonably close, and that's what happened here in the forest. And once I managed to find a group, they were quite photographable. And then at the end of the Philippines section is this Philippine eagle, again photographed in captivity because they are incredibly rare in the wild now, and just photographed in a captive breeding center where there are people attempting to rescue this bird from probable extinction in the next few years. So you're never going to get a portrait this close of a Philippine eagle in the wild if you actually manage to ever see one in the wild at all. So nice to go to a captive breeding center where they're well looked after and get this really nice portrait, which really captures sort of the essence of this bird in many ways, and very much sort of the icon of conservation in the Philippines. Now we swing right back to the UK, and again the idea of knowing about your species and species within your area and their relative importance and so on. This shot, about the size of a sparrow, so quite difficult to get close to. It's a soil bunting, which is in the UK is a very rare bird. It's outside the UK, it lives around some of the Mediterranean countries, but in the UK, it's restricted just to a few pockets in South Devon, and really literally just around where I live here, around Tidmouth and a few other places like that. This particular bird was photographed at Dawlish Warren in the mouth of the River Exe. And this is an example of careful stalking, of just persistently following a group of birds around early one morning until eventually they gave up and just kind of accepted my presence. Decided I wasn't a threat after all, and then I was able to come in quite close to some of these birds. And this is photographed with a 300mm lens with a 2x converter. Not too long after the sun came up, so we got quite a bit of good light. Enabled me to get really quite a nice portrait of this very rare bird, which you don't see, which obviously you see occasionally around here where I live, but you don't see it anywhere else in the UK. And then finally, a word on gulls. There is no. Gulls are very much maligned, of course. Seagulls, there is no such thing as a seagull. And the problem and the bad reputation they have is all down to this one single species, the herring gull. But there is a string of gulls species in Britain, and almost all of them, including actually the herring gull, are in trouble. They're in decline and they're struggling, and they need our protection and our consideration. And part of that is photographing them to show people that they're out there. And it really, it's important to put aside preconceptions and misconceptions and about this bird. This is not a herring gull. It's actually a lesser black-backed gull, and it's photographed sitting on a nest in one of its rather few breeding colonies. This one on the island of Dew in the Isles of Scilly. And it's just, you can distinguish it from a herring gull, firstly by the red ring around its eye, and secondly by the fact that the greyness on its back is actually darker than a herring gull. If the two were to stand side by side, you'd see the difference, but they are roughly the same size. And so this is a lesser black-backed gull, which is not that common a bird. And so normally you're not allowed into the breeding area on Dew while these birds are breeding, but the Selonian Wildlife Trust invited me in to have a look at these. And I tried to get this, I shot this for my Wild Southwest project, but I couldn't get it into the bird because the designer book just didn't want to know. He really did not want to have gulls in the book. They don't rate as wildlife, apparently. But there you go. And we finally, a couple of shots showing the other side of things, people watching wildlife. This is in the Masai Mara in Kenya. And I always get slightly uneasy feeling in my stomach when I see this kind of thing, and people surrounding the wildlife as it walks across, in this case, a leopard. And it's wonderful to see these animals, of course, and it's wonderful that other people can get to see them. But I always feel like, oh, I don't know. And of course, I'm part of the same problem. I'm in another group of vehicles on the other side of this leopard. But I obviously have to sort of console myself, saying that everybody here, me included, has paid quite a bit of money which goes to the conservation of these animals and conservation of the habitat, and also income to the local communities, which helps to keep their economy going and gives them good justification to not just go out and shoot all the wildlife, which they probably would otherwise. And a slightly similar but slightly different thing in the Farne Islands, something to gladden the heart of any camera executive, and just makes me wonder a little bit about wildlife photography in the UK sometimes. All crowding together, everybody crowding together into one group, just all pointing at the puffins, where, well, off to the left, there's just tens of thousands of guillemots, which are just completely ignored. And I think, well, don't ignore the guillemots, don't ignore, everything should be photographed, everything should be enjoyed, everything should be appreciated. And puffins are the star attractions because they are, well, they are one of the fashion species, one of the leading fashion species in magazines and books and so on. So it's understandable. And again, everybody there, including me, paid quite a bit of money to be there that day, and it helps go to pay the National Trust to look after these islands and protect them and ensure that the species are able to continue to survive into the future. And so then that really is the end of the talk. My usual last slide, just to remind you all about my books about the Southwest and the websites. The next talk is going to be also wildlife photography, but about insects and flowers. So basically about all the small stuff, so close-up and macro photography, which will be on the 21st of April. In addition, we may actually get to be able to run a couple of photography courses in the coming few weeks. So the first one this spring, hopefully, if things don't go bad again, will be on the 17th of April, South Devon coastal photography at Big Bree and Bantham, and then wildlife photography on the 24th of April, which will be at Dunster and Lynmouth on Exmoor. So there's still a few spaces on these courses. These will be limited to 6 people, but there are still a couple of spaces on each one. So please, if you'd like to come along, join up, that'd be great. And then in the autumn, in September, I'm still hoping to be able to run the Iceland tour. I think we'll make a final decision on that in July. But if you'd love to come to do some really wild landscape photography and hopefully some wildlife photography too, there's the possibility of being able to do a whale watching trip during this tour, then it'd be great if you'd like to sign up. To commit yourself, if you sign up for the tour, then you pay £100 deposits. But if we do end up having to scrap it for whatever reasons, COVID and whatever, then you would get your deposit back. And you'd only have to pay the full whack once we really decide finally to go ahead in late July, then we pay the full whack. And again, if you end up having to cancel it in the end, then you would still get your money back. So if you'd like to come along, that would be great. Anyway, so that's finally it. I'm going to unshare my screen, and then if you want to ask any questions, please open your microphones. We've run on a little bit longer than normal tonight, but we're still there. So ask some questions, and that would be wonderful. Just to talk away for a few minutes if you have questions. Thank you very much. Ooh, I need a drink. As always, a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but and I probably blinded you with all the stuff that went on there. Anybody got any questions? No? Yeah. I've explained everything so well, and that all completely bamboozled everybody, one or the other. So a message from Andy to saying just envy. Oh yeah, no, I've been quite lucky in many ways to actually get out there and do these things. That's for sure. Not as much as I used to, and not at all at the moment, except perhaps very locally. Mike Burrows, thanks Nigel, very interesting. Like the flamingos, oh well, yes, those are always interesting. That's for sure. And from Zoe Pollard, yeah, really good evening. Thanks, Nigel. Looking forward to booking onto some of the courses. Yes, I'm looking forward to seeing you. And from Zed Carapacino, thanks, Nigel. Fernando and I always enjoy your presentations. It's great to hear you talk about. Hang on, let me just pull this whole thing up. Talk about my favorite area of photography, wildlife. Yes, it's very true. It's a terrific area, quite challenging, but it's terrific. From Steph, thank you, excellent talk. Well, thank you for coming along. Okay, so
I see. Yeah.
Everybody has no questions, then I'll call it a night. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. And I did go on a little bit long with all those bullet points, but they kind of set the scene as well, and hopefully sort of enabled you to sort of see what I was talking about when we got to the pictures. Okay, so I'm going to sign off here. If you would like to do the same, and then we'll talk again we'll see each other again on the 21st of April. If you haven't already signed up for that talk and want to do so, then registration is is open. So we'll talk to you then and see you then. Thank you
Thank
very much. See you
Thanks very
again.
much, Nigel.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Nigel.